Yeah, Festus, you raise hand. Festus. आपका mic बंद है? Hello. Yeah, Festus, do you want to speak with anybody?
Hello,
Yeah, please carry on.
I'm Festus.
Yeah. Do you want some to tell something?
No, I was trying to connect.
Acha, okay. So it's okay now.
Yes, I'm all right. Thank you.
Okay.
No raising hand.
Yeah, very good evening, Dr. Harold, sir.
Hello.
Yeah.
Good
How are you,
evening.
sir? Yeah, very good evening and very good morning at Ithaca.
Yes, it's still relatively early in the morning here, and we just had about 20 centimeters of snow that fell overnight. So it's a beautiful white landscape around here. So later this morning I'll have to shovel my driveway and remove some of that snow.
I think, sir, after 8 years, we are just meeting virtually now.
Yes. So you can hear me well, and it looks like the video is working okay.
Yeah, everything, sir, everything.
Great. And the conference has been going well?
Yeah, since 14th, very eminent speakers have delivered their lectures, and even more than 2,500 participants have responded very well.
That is really excellent. Congratulations.
Thanks a lot, sir. I think till Bhaskar must not be in contact, no? Bhaskar Mitra?
Yes, I'm still in touch with Bhaskar. Not recently, but he still works for the Tata Cornell Institute, and he facilitates a lot of our work in India, and so that's all been good. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, still I think means SRTT, Tata Trust and Cornell is still working in Uttar Pradesh, I think.
We're working in Bihar. We have a collaboration with the university in Pusa, and so I would be happy to connect you with Dr. Like, Dr. Vanchan Like, who is our primary collaborator there.
Okay.
Perhaps you know him. He's a soil scientist who works at Dr. Rajendra Prasad Central Agriculture University. Yeah.
It is Central University.
Yes.
Yeah.
In Pusa, in central part of Bihar.
Okay. So I think after Bhaskar means the master scholar under this SRT Tata Trust and Cornell program, we don't actually have any access with Bhaskar afterwards, because he was a master student under I think Robin.
Yes. Robin unfortunately passed away several years ago.
Yes. Yeah.
So.
But I think afterwards you are not visited India, no?
I have not been in India for maybe about 2 years, I think. Of course, with the pandemic, there hasn't been any travel. So yeah, unfortunately, hopefully that will that will change.
Yeah.
And we're looking forward to getting the vaccine here in the United States. And I know in India, they're also preparing for a vaccine rollout. And
But I
so
think
we hope for the best.
yeah, in US also the situation is still not in control, no?
Yeah, it's really, unfortunately, it's not bad around where I live because we live in a smaller town. But yeah, it's not good. It's not good. People are not always responsible. That's a
Yeah.
big part of the problem. Yeah,
India too also the same situation is there.
yeah, it's a difficult situation. But I think that that we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, and I think that for better or worse, we've learned a lot from this pandemic.
Yeah,
Despite the
exactly.
fact that we lost a lot of people. One example of that is that we are now very comfortable with doing conferences this way, and we can really reduce the travel and make it a lot easier to do these kind of communications. I often get invited to give a presentation, but I'm always reluctant to do a lot of travel. It takes a lot of time, and we've now learned how to do presentations well
Yeah.
using this technology. So it's been a blessing. I cannot
Yeah.
imagine what it would have been like if we had the pandemic 20 years ago and we didn't have this technology. So kudos to the technology people who help us communicate and still get our work done.
No, we can say it's the positive side of COVID-19.
Yeah.
So this is our team member, sir. Dr. Paslawar is actually chief scientist at Center for Organic Agriculture Research and Training, and he is a professor at Department of Agronomy. And particularly, he is working on conservation agriculture since last 5 years. My another colleague, Dr. Mali, he is also a soil scientist, and he is particularly working on carbon sequestration right now.
Great.
Dr. Upendra Kulkarni, he is entomologist particularly. And Dr. Yogesh Ingre, he is a plant pathologist. He is working on particularly on citrus. He is specialist in citrus species. Dr. Milind Giri, he is a pulse agronomist actually. He is working on pulses. And I think you are quite aware about the situation in Akola and in the periphery that we are having a rain-fed agriculture system. And you have visited the saline tract of just in the vicinity of Akola itself. I
Yes.
think Dr. Kavar sir was there when you visited Dr.
Oh, okay. Great. It's nice to meet you all or see you all again.
Yeah.
And congratulations again with setting up this successful conference. So can I just ask you a question? How would you like to deal with the questions? Will we be using the chat feature and doing it that way?
Actually, what we are doing since last 14th, some questions we are just picking up from chat box, and some questions from those who are actually raising their hands.
Okay.
Yeah, because most of the around 70-60 participants are abroad, from abroad itself, representing Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Nigeria. So that's why those who are actually raising their hands, we are just giving an opportunity to interface with you. And some questions we are just picking it from chat box itself. And the second thing, we'll just start your presentation, and before end of presentation, 10 minutes before, we'll just open the chat box, and accordingly the participant can just drop their questions.
Great. That sounds good. Did you give me already screen sharing?
Yeah, I think we are allowed.
Okay. Let me see. Shall I do that then?
Yeah, it is visible.
You see it now in presentation mode?
Yeah. Very well.
Okay.
So we'll start after 3-4 minutes because still participants are in joining mode. So once 7:30 starts, we'll just start the presentation, sir.
Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah. Good.
येऊ का तिथे?
Oh, yes.
इथं बसावं एकदा स्टार्ट
Okay, so very warm welcome, friends. Again, we have assembled virtually for a most important session, which will be delivered by Dr. Van S. Harold. He is a senior professor at Department of Soil Science at Cornell University, USA. He will be sharing his ideas on soil resilience and magnitude of organic farming. So, sir, actually, the program was started from 14th of December, and earlier we have covered many topics. And considering the significance of soils and the sustainability under organic agriculture, it's our great pleasure that you are sharing and you have spared your extremely valuable time for these participants. This particular training program, participants from various countries, particularly Ethiopia, Iraq, Israel, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Nigeria, even from Italy, they have participated in this training program. And many participants have raised some questions in respect of sustainability of soils and crop production. And with this view, the significance of today's particular topic is having vital importance. So that's why At this juncture, I would like to welcome on behalf of Dr. PDKB Apola, and I think you are very much aware, but still whatever the updates in university made during last 5 to 10 years. So I would like to share the same because you visited, I think, in 2012. So afterwards, Center for Organic Agriculture Research and Training has been established, and under this particular center, we are encouraging organic based cropping systems and crop production technologies. Similarly, we are studying soils by adding green manures, compost, and various other inputs. So under rampant agriculture system as well as the other agricultural systems, the significance of the organic inputs and the resilience of soil considering the climate change and the mitigation challenges, it is highly essential the topic was. So for this, you have spared your valuable time. I am very much thankful for the same, sir. So this particular session will be coordinated by Dr. Upendra Kulkarni. He is Associate Professor at Department of Agricultural Entomology. And Dr. D.V. Mari and Dr. Milind Giri will be a rapporteur for the same. They will just take note of all the issues raised during the training, this particular lecture. And at the end, before 10 minutes of your lecture, we'll just open the chat box. So accordingly, we can have a direct interface with the participants. So with this, I hand over this particular dais to Dr. Kulkarni and request him to proceed further with your brief introduction.
Hello everybody, my friend Dr. Nitin I have already introduced me and my team. So we are in the fourth day of this international training on organic farming field to fashion, and which is organized through virtual mode by this university. We have among us a very special guest today in Dr. Harold Van Nys, who will deliver a lecture on soil resilience and magnitude of organic farming. Dr. Harold is a professor of soil science and served as chair of the Soil and Crop Sciences Department at the Cornell University in USA. He was the president of the Soil Science Society in America in the year 2016. He leads the Cornell Soil Health Institute, pioneered computational technology for precision crop nitrogen management, and Dr. Harold and his team won $1 million Tillage nitrogen reduction challenge prize in the current years. So congratulations, sir. Dr. Harold developed improved methodologies for field experimental design and measurements. His publications include over 160 journal publications and articles. He also wrote several books and book chapters, including the seminal soil health book, Building Soils for Better Crops. He also mentored over 50 graduate students. Sir, I heartily welcome you. I am also with me my colleagues Dr. D.V. Mali, Assistant Professor of Soil Science and Agricultural Chemistry, and Dr. M.D. Giri, Assistant Professor of Agronomy, and they will perform the function of the rapporteurs. So I welcome both of them. And with these few words of introduction, I request Dr. Harold sir to start his presentations on the allotted topic. Sir, you please proceed.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I should say that I have very fond memories of visiting your university back in 2012 and learned a lot about all the great work that's being done. So welcome everyone. I come to you from the state of New York in the United States, and it's still relatively early in the morning here. I know for most of you it's the afternoon or probably the evening for many of you in India. So the topic for today that I've been asked to address is basically relates to understanding soil health. That's maybe the subtitle that I've used, and but we're going to look at that in the context. Is there a problem? Sorry. Okay, I understand you just muted. So soil health is very important for organic agriculture, and I'll try to explain that. But also, organic agriculture can be very beneficial for soil health and creating resilience in the soil system. So let's start by a little bit of background on soil health, which has become a great international interest. So for humans and civilizations, soil health is very important, and we might look at that sort of through two different pathways. One is sort of through the agriculture, nutrition, food pathway, because of course, most of the food is being produced from the soil, and so the health of the soil is very important for plant and animal health, and therefore for human nutrition. We also interact with soils through what we might call other ecosystem services that relates more to the human environment interaction, things like water quality and water quantity or climate. So soil is an important resource in that respect. But what we have maybe paid less attention to is how human activities have in turn impacted soil health. And that generally has had a negative impact because soils have become degraded from human management and producing crops, etc. But also we can improve the health of the soil through good management practices. So that's obviously going to be the focus of this presentation. So the interest in soil health, which is maybe from the past 20 years, but especially maybe the past 10 years here in the United States, is really driven by this renewed recognition of soil as a critical natural resource, not only for food production, but also water, biosphere, and climate. And it certainly in the Western world, a lot of people are much more aware of food and health, and people make the connection between food and the soil. And I can tell you, I've been in this job for 33 years, that in the earlier years, most people didn't really understand why soils were important. But we also have seen that the anthropogenic impacts on soils are very significant, and that has to do both with the fact that soils have become degraded, but also the fact that we have more or less run out of productive soils on the earth. So we really need to make better use of the soils that we have, of the land that's currently available, because the remaining lands need to be protected for as natural habitats, like the rainforests in Asia and Africa and South America, and many of the grassland areas that also need to be protected. So we need to do a better job of managing the soils that we currently have. So the concept of soil health really relates to soil functioning and therefore the well-being of the soil as it relates to functioning. And so what are some of those functions? Some examples are supporting the growth of plants and food production. And most of us probably that's our primary interest with soils. But it's also, soils are a very important part of the water cycle because they partition water and solute flow at the land surface. So that means that the precipitation that's being received at the land surface, ideally is being infiltrated into the soil, where it can be retained and made available to plants and organisms. But it can also run off and cause erosion and all kinds of problems. So that partitioning is really an important function. Soils also release, filter, and buffer various chemical compounds like nutrients that are needed for the fertility of the soil to support plants, but also carbon, of course, which has become of great interest in the past years because the opportunities around soil to store carbon. Soils also serve as an important habitat for organisms, many of them that we don't even know yet. We haven't even classified, but soils are a very rich habitat for organisms. And then, of course, soils are being used for a number of other purposes, like providing structural support or maybe making bricks or other things. But we're mostly focused on the first four. So I'd like to kind of take you back to the very, very basics of soils and food, and what are soils and food really made of? Well, they're made up of mineral material that comes from the soil, basically from the rock, from the dissolution of rock material. Water, of course, air, mostly nitrogen and carbon that's in the air that's being used for photosynthesis. The sun as a source of energy, also, through photosynthesis. And then basically the genetic material that makes up the various organisms, which is, plants or animals. So that's basically it. Those 5 ingredients, you might say, are responsible for supporting terrestrial life. So how do soils build over time? And how do they store nutrients and carbon? So the primary process, and that sort of maybe makes soils very special, is the fact that they can retain water through capillarity. So soils are not solid rock. They're made up of small particles. And so that allows for this physical process for the soils to retain water through adhesive and cohesive forces. So the soil can act like a sponge. And that water can then be made available to plants, but it also is responsible for the weathering and dissolution of these solid minerals. So the minerals are locked up in the rock material, in the particles, and they get slowly dissolved, and then they can be retained by the soil through, say, cation exchange capacity, and then they can be made available. So the secondary process then is where the organisms come in. And so first of all, plants. So plants can use the water and the minerals to grow in combination with carbon and nitrogen that comes from the air and solar energy, that is the source of energy basically in the whole system. And plants can grow, take up the water and the minerals and turn them into organic sources of nutrients and carbon. And that in turn supports these soil organisms, and the soil becomes a storage reservoir for carbon, nutrients, and water. And that supports a lot of these functions that we talked about before. So soil also, in a way, then becomes a little bit like a bank account that we can withdraw from. These nutrients are being stored, and we can withdraw those nutrients. But of course, like a bank account, you can't keep withdrawing. You also have to put something back into it to make it sustainable. But a natural, you might say virgin soil that comes out of forest or grassland is a tremendous storage reservoir for nutrients and carbon that supports life on Earth. But of course, we need to use, with a large human population, we need to use and tap into that storage reservoir, and which is what we've been doing for centuries or even millennia in some places. And we have started to till the soil. The soil has been grazed by animals to an extent that it causes overgrazing, and this causes exposure of the soil to the elements and, as you know, runoff and erosion. So when that happens, of course, we lose the top of the soil, which is the most fertile part of the soil. That's where the nutrients and the carbon are located. In addition, when we till the soil intensively, we promote the decomposition of the organic matter by oxidizing it, and that's another way we lose the carbon and the nutrients. We see compaction from equipment and loss of soil aggregation as a result of that, and we often see a net carbon and nutrient removal. What I mean with that is that we have this reservoir that the soil has built up through these soil forming processes that I just discussed. And slowly but steadily, we've been taken out of the reservoir and removing some of the carbon and nutrients. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a few minutes. So the concept of soil health is really caught on. Some people prefer the term soil quality, but many people, especially practitioners outside the academic scientific community, they like the term soil health because people understand soil health, even though it's not that well defined, but they understand that soil health relates to well-being of the soil. Like human health, it refers to well-being. And we see a move from the maybe more simplistic approach where we focus on individual problems, for example, nutrients or certain pathogens, to look more holistically and overall health well-being. So many of you, certainly soil scientists, are familiar with the idea of Liebig's law of the minimum, which has been a focus of soil fertility for about a century now, where the idea is that the productivity of the soil is constrained by the most limiting factor, the nutrient that is available in a minimal amount. And once you relieve that, so once you can apply that nutrients, so through, for example, fertilizer, then you increase the overall productivity. And that makes sense for a lot of the chemical properties of soils. But now we've seen that we've sort of addressed those problems because we've been applying fertilizer. But we see that the emphasis now needs to be more on the biological and the physical limitations of the soil, because that's now holding back the productivity of the land and the health of the soil. And so that relates then also to resilience to climate change, better pest management. I'll talk about that in a minute. The impact on not only yield, but also crop quality and the nutrition and the minerals that we get from the crops. And it also addresses this concern with expensive inputs. So the more traditional way of thinking is if there's a problem, we address that by applying an input. It's kind of like if you have a health problem, you take a pill. But we now recognize that we need to think more in terms of overall well-being, and that the simple solutions are managing based on simple solutions really has its limitations. So tillage is an important component of that because tillage is not a natural process. It exposes the soil to the elements, causing runoff and erosion. But it also breaks down aggregates. We lose organic matter because we oxidize the organic matter that's otherwise protected in aggregates. And this sort of creates this spiral of soil degradation. Because we're losing the organic matter in aggregation, we then have increased runoff and erosion and further losses of organic matter. A lot of times that stimulates doing more tillage because the soil becomes degraded. And the only way the soil can be managed is by keeping disturbing it and fluffing it up. And so we then have further problems with less water storage, less diversity of soil organisms. And that starts to impact yields, and that can create hunger and malnutrition. Now, in many cases, these processes have been somewhat masked by better fertility management, better use of fertilizers, better crop genetics, so increased yield potential. But we now come to the realization that that is also hitting a ceiling, that there are, that a lot of for example, the genetic potential of crops is constrained by the soil's ability to support it. So soil health is basically becoming a limiting factor. And it tends to increase the external inputs that are needed to maintain the yields. So, and part of the problem is related to the structure of agriculture and how we've changed how we produce crops and animals. So on the left side here, you see what may be a more early agricultural system in places like the Americas and Europe, and maybe a more sustainable system or subsistence system in some other parts of the world, is where you have an integration of the plants, the animals, and the humans. So the plants produce the basic feed stuff, whether it's feed for animals or it's grains for humans. And they were all sort of integrated on a single farm or maybe a single community. But with that, there was quite a bit of cycling of the carbon and the nutrients, because the production and the consumption were all more or less in the same area. So the waste materials from the animals and the humans basically went back to the land. When we had urbanizing societies, in some cases going back several millennia, in maybe places like Egypt or the city of Rome, we see that we see in separation of the primary producers, the farms, and the humans that are living in the urban areas, where they of course could not produce the food. Now, most of the carbon and nutrients in that case are still being recycled, because the animals and the plants are still on the same land, basically the same farm. And of course, most of the carbon and nutrients that goes through animals actually gets returned. But we see that either the grains that are being consumed in urban societies or the animals, so the carbon and nutrients from that are no longer going back to the farm. So we see a decrease in carbon and nutrient cycling. Now, in a more industrial agriculture situation, which is what many parts of the world are, even in places like India, you have many specialized farms. We see a separation of the production of crops from the raising of animals and the consumption by humans. So we have specialized grain production areas. A good example is much of the central part of the United States is that way. But I know parts of the Indo-Gangetic Plain are also like that. These are grain production areas, and most of the crops, the grains, are being exported off the farm and they go somewhere else. And so in that case, there is a minimum amount of carbon and nutrient cycling. So that's one of the causes why, if you look at the lower right here, we see that the natural soil here with high organic matter and very good aggregation, and after maybe 100 years of intensive crop production, the soil becomes like the one on the left here, less organic matter, much less structure and all that, because there's not enough carbon and nutrient cycling. So let me kind of put that into a little bit of a picture. So under a natural system, whether it may be a forest or grassland system, or maybe a more integrated crop livestock system that we saw more in earlier agricultural situations, we see that most of the biomass that's being produced is being recycled into the crop. It may be leaf litter, it may be roots dying off, it may be above ground plant material that dies off and is being recycled, and maybe a very small fraction, maybe 0 to 20%, 0% basically if it's a completely natural system, maybe 20% if it's an integrated crop livestock system, is being exported off the farm. But the vast majority of the carbon and nutrients is being recycled. And I have a little cartoonish worm here. So that worm is really happy because it receives a lot of carbon and nutrients. Now let's contrast that to maybe a modern cash grain situation. This may be a rice farm in the northwestern Gangetic Plain. It may be a maize or soybean farm in Iowa, or a wheat farm in Ukraine or Bulgaria. In this case, we're growing the crops, but about 60 to 70% of the carbon and nutrients in the grain are being harvested, and they're being taken off the farm. They're being sold and exported. So what's left is the crop residue, which is typically of much lower quality in terms of carbon and nutrients. That maybe gets returned, but it's only maybe about 30 to 40%. So you add to that some additional losses of carbon dioxide from tillage because we promote the degradation of organic matter and some erosion. And so now we have a situation that where much less carbon and nutrients are being cycled and actually a lot more flows off the farm. And so my little worm here is a little nervous because you can see it doesn't have enough carbon and nutrients to really support a good biological system. Now you might say, well, aren't we replenishing those nutrients with fertilizers? And so, yes, we are. So a lot of the nutrients that are being harvested are, in many cases, are being put back onto the land. And believe me, that's really important. Even if it's synthetic nutrients, you still need those. It's much better than not. But in a situation like this, we're not replenishing the carbon. So the nutrients, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium, the calcium, etc., are often being replenished in a modern agriculture system, but the carbon is not. And so this creates then this lack of balance between the nutrients and the carbon, and this creates a lot of concerns with soil health. Now, this flow of nutrients off a farm can happen, at the farm scale, it can happen at the regional scale, but it even happens at the global scale. So this is a map from Rabobank, which is, I think, the world's largest agricultural lender. And it shows the flow of grain and oilseed crops. So a lot of it is soybean and maize, sunflower maybe as well. And you see that the primary source of that is from the Americas, and it flows primarily to Asia and to some extent to Europe and maybe other parts of South America. And so, obviously, it's dominated by soybean exports, primarily from the United States and Brazil, and to a lesser extent Argentina, to China, where China and Japan, Korea, places like that, where the population is relatively high relative to the availability of good agricultural land. And that's the same for some parts of Europe, certainly Western Europe. So these countries import a lot of these grains. And the point I'm trying to make here is that these grains are the nutrients and the carbon that are also the ingredients for soil health. So many of the countries in the Americas, so Brazil, US, and Argentina, are basically exporting not only the grain, but the basic ingredients of soil health with that. Now, many of you are, of course, are in India. India is not that much impacted by the international grain trade. Most of the grains in India are produced within country, but there are a lot of regional nutrient and carbon flows in India, because you have certain areas where a lot of the grains are being produced. So the main point here that I want to get across is that the carbon and nutrients go from one part of the world to another part of the world. They create deficits in some areas, and these are typically some of the best, what were naturally some of the best soils in the world, but are now degrading. And of course, they can tend to accumulate in other parts of the world where they create problems with eutrophication of waters and problems like that. So it's really kind of a structural issue of modern agriculture at the global level. So that brings us to organic systems. So as you know, organic agriculture disallows the use of synthetic nutrients. And so that means that if you are growing crops organically, you have to apply the nutrients with carbon, because you have to use organic sources of nutrients. And those can be cover crops or green manures, or from rotations, of course, livestock manure, compost, etc. So these, in an organic system, the nutrients and the carbon are jointly managed, and therefore the health of the soil is increased. Now, we still have the same amount of harvest losses. We still have, only 30 to 40% of the carbon and nutrients returned. We still typically have carbon losses from tillage and from erosion, but the big difference is that we now bring in organic fertilizers and green manure. So much of these losses are now being restored in terms of organic fertilizers. So we're connecting again the nutrients and the carbon, and that's really important. So organic systems by their very nature are better for soil health. And that also has a number of other benefits that promote the use of organic agriculture, say by having better pest management and things like that. So I'll talk about that shortly. And so going back to our little worm, so our little worm is pretty happy again because it has the carbon and the energy and the nutrients for these organisms to live in the soil. Okay, so let's take a deep breath here and shift on to talking about organic matter and why organic matter is so important. So in our book, the book that Fred Magdoff and I wrote, Building Soils for Better Crops, and I'll show you a reference to that at the end of the presentation, we basically say there are 3 general types of organic matter in soils. And it's kind of a funny way of saying it, but we're saying it, there's the living organic matter, the dead organic matter, and then the very dead organic matter. And it's a good way of looking at it because they each have their own role, and an important role as it relates to soil health and crops. So the living organic matter, as you probably know, it's all the organisms that are in the soil that play important roles. And they are a wide range of species, bacteria, fungi, nematodes, earthworms, springtails, mites, moles, etc., as well as plant roots. They are also living organic matter in the soil. And they are functioning in a soil ecosystem. They make nutrients available, they acquire nutrients, they suppress diseases, they help aggregate particles in the soil. And so all of these are very important. Now there's, when it comes to organisms, there are what we might say good guys and bad guys. The good guys are typically dominant, but the bad guys might take over if there's not enough good guys to keep them in check. So, and this system is fed by what we now call the soil food web. So that's the different trophic levels of organisms that function in the soil. Now, to start with, the original source of the carbon and the nutrients is, of course, plant material, whether it's either plant material that grows in situ or whether it's something that's applied as maybe processed plant material like manure or compost. The original source of energy, of course, is the sun, because through photosynthesis, the energy is captured. The nutrients are, and the carbon and the nitrogen are then basically stored as plant material that then turns over as dead organic matter. And that feeds all these organisms in the soil. So if we don't have a continuous supply of fresh organic matter as food for all these organisms, then the system is not able to function quite as well. So we sometimes joke and say, well, it's sort of it's a jungle down there underground, and it really is. Everybody eats everybody else, and it's a competitive environment. But the main point is that's the way the natural system works. And but when we disrupt the provision of organic carbon and nutrients, we also disrupt this natural soil food web. So roots, I want to highlight a little bit because roots are providing a very important source of carbon and nutrients in the soil. They also create biopores or large pores for the water to move through, for oxygen and aeration. It also helps other roots grow by they can use the channels of the earlier roots. And this is the primary source of transfer of organic matter deep into the soil profile. Most organic matter is at the surface, like leaf litter or whatever. It's really only the roots that bring that organic matter deep into the soil. They stimulate food chain activities by exuding sugars and things like that. But they can also have beneficial impacts by not stimulating, but inhibiting certain undesirable weeds, insects, and diseases. And so this picture here shows how important perennial roots are versus annual ones. So this is a picture from the Land Institute in Kansas that shows during the year the root system of perennial wheatgrass. And you can see, that most of the biomass is actually underground as roots, certainly compared to the above ground biomass. And that's, of course, fairly stable throughout the year, although there's quite a bit of turnover of those roots that sort of stimulates the biological activity. Now, it's hard to see here, but there's also annual wheat and the rooting system with that. So this is it in December, because it's winter wheat. We have a little bit of roots, and then in the spring, when the wheat starts to grow again, we see a few more, and then at harvest time we see this many roots, and so about the same amount of above ground and below ground biomass. But compared to the perennial system, of course, there's much less. So annual crops in general provide much less carbon to the soil system than perennial systems. Okay, so that was the living organic matter. Now the other type is the dead organic matter. And it's basically the same material, but then it has died and then is available for decomposition by soil organisms and the release of the nutrients and the energy. And so it can have many forms. It can be crop residues. It can be, here's a dead mat of grass that's slowly going to turn over, or it can have been, processed through the guts of an animal, like manure, or it could have been compost or something like that. But this is basically what you might call fresh organic matter that is available for consumption by the soil organisms. And then the last type is the very dead organic matter. And that's the material that has gone already through the decomposition process. But what's left is what we might call the most recalcitrant part of the organic matter that doesn't really decompose any further. It's the last stage of the decomposition. And so this is primarily helps with retaining nutrients and water in the soil, or sometimes holding contaminants. And this is really the stable carbon that is being stored in the soil. And that so when we talk about carbon farming or carbon sequestration, this is the type of carbon that will stay, that doesn't get decomposed. And it's primarily associated with the organo-mineral bonds. So it's the organic matter that binds to the clay particles and the silt particles, and it's the stable source of carbon and organic matter in the soil. So, yes, how is that being stored? I just gave you a little bit of an introduction. It's primarily these the bonds between the organic matter and clay particles. So again, it's like capillarity is a process that allows the soil to be a sponge for water, and it's these organo-mineral bonds that allows the soil to be a sponge for organic matter and carbon. And so that's an very important function that soil play in the environment and in the ecosystem. It can also be stored inside small aggregates, where it's sort of physically protecting from the organic matter from decomposition, but that's also with tillage that can be disturbed. So it's not necessarily a long-term stable source of protection of organic matter. The process of human humification is basically what produces these stable, complex substances that are resistant to further decomposition. And it may be worthwhile mentioning that char, which is produced by incomplete burning, is also a very stable form of organic matter in the soil. It basically doesn't decompose it decomposes at a very, very slow rate over hundreds of years. So charred material is also relatively stable, but it's also not very biologically active. So an important concept here is that, going back to our bank account, that it's a balance of gains and losses. So the soil is a storage reservoir for organic matter and carbon, nutrients, and water. But if we take too much out of it by producing crops and removing the carbon and nutrients through harvest, and we're not putting anything back in terms of recycling through manure or compost or using cover crops or perennials in rotations, we're going to be losing and losing and losing. So we need to make sure that there's a good balance between what we take out through crop production and what we put back in through good management practices. So some of the important biological processes is this organic matter promotes plant growth. It's there's a lot of stimulation of plant growth, so that benefits the crops and creates higher yields. Rhizobacteria, that is bacteria that have associations with roots, are very important in that, and there's a whole lecture on that particular topic. The plant hormone production that occurs, and also induced resistance, inducing resistance to especially pathogens. So that basically relates to the idea of a healthy soil means healthy plants. Especially in organic systems, you have very limited options in terms of controlling pathogens. And so the best approach is to create a very healthy soil environment that is what we call suppressive to pathogens, that has a lot of beneficial organisms that directly compete with the pathogens for space and food. So the idea is that pathogens don't have an opportunity to become dominant and to really impact the crop, because they're being held in check by a multitude of other organisms. So an example of that is the fungus trichoderma that can control Pythium, which is of course a nasty pathogen for a lot of crops. So this idea of creating a healthy environment or overall well-being that suppresses pathogens is very similar to what we do with good human health. Is that if we create if we make our bodies healthy but through good through exercise, through good nutrition and things like that, and good habits, we create a much more suppressive system and makes us more immune to any pathogen. So other biological processes is the physical benefits of soil organisms and organic matter, because they create aggregates and they make them stable. And this is very important, because if we just had individual particles, especially if the soil has a lot of clay in it, the soil would be very dense and roots wouldn't be able to grow. So the fact that these organisms can enmesh soil particles into aggregates through their secretions, they can encapsulate aggregates, and they can enhance those organic mineral bonds. So you get a really nicely aggregated soil. And in many cases, that's very critical. And I remember my visit to Akola some years ago. The soils are very heavy in clay, and if you didn't have good aggregation, they really become very compacted. So this is just to give you a little bit of a visual idea of that. On the left there is a soil that's very low in organic matter, has been intensively used for many years, has become very compacted because it doesn't have any aggregates. And so this soil has a lot of problems with infiltration and root development, etc. And the one on the right has a lot of organic matter. It has good aggregates, as you can see. It stimulates biological activity. And so that's the kind of situation that we're aiming for. You can see some of the larger pores as well in this aggregate. So, and why is that important? Well, we want aggregated soils because they provide us with a range of pore sizes. And so in a way, these aggregates form the skeleton that allows a lot of the activities to occur in the soil. So here's a picture of an aggregate, and the aggregate is made up of sub-aggregates, smaller ones. So this is the large aggregate, and here's the smaller aggregates, and those can in turn be made up of yet smaller aggregates. So it's kind of a hierarchy. But this arrangement results in large pores, intermediate pores, and small pores, and they each have important functions. So the large pores we need for drainage and water transmission, aeration, for roots to grow, because they need to be able to get into a large enough pore to proliferate. The intermediate pores are important for water retention and many of the biological functions. Many organisms are in this intermediate size of pores. And the very small pores are important for moisture retention. That's what helps a crop grow even into a dry season. So we really want this aggregation so that we can have a good physical functioning of the soil. So I mentioned root proliferation, and you can see on the left here a well-structured soil where the roots are growing well. The roots also have small lateral roots and root hairs that are much more effective in taking up water and nutrients. So we have a healthier plant. While on the right, we have a compacted soil. We have a crust on the surface, which creates problems with germination sometimes. Even when the plant does germinate, the roots can't grow well. They're kind of stubby and short, and they're very inefficient in taking up water and nutrients. And a lot of times they don't even go into the subsoil, and so they cannot explore the water and nutrients that are deeper in the soil. And of course, that creates overall a much less healthy plant and a plant that's much more susceptible to drought stress, to excess water stress if you get too much rain, to pathogens, etc. And of course, it also impacts this other very important function of soil, which is to infiltrate water and store it and make it available to plants, or slowly let it seep down to groundwater and to replenish those resources. And if we have a poorly degraded soil, we may have a crust and a seal on the top, and it promotes runoff and erosion. And that's of course not good. It impacts water quality and quantity, and it causes flooding, causes contamination, etc. And just to give you a little bit of a picture of that, this is what a soil looks like that's not protected by biomass, or at least very little, and it becomes very dense because the raindrops basically disperse the aggregates. The aggregates aren't strong enough to withstand the raindrops, and that's not a good situation. So I want to go back briefly to diseases, and I know some of you are plant pathologists, and you are familiar with the concept much more than I am of the disease triangle. So it involves a host plant, which is typically the plant that you want to grow. That's typically your crop, although it could be a cover crop that is maybe not a good choice because it's a good host for the pathogens. But let's assume it's your main crop. And then, of course, you need to have the pathogen present. And so that can be an issue that relates to soil health, in that if we have a suppressive soil, if we have a soil that has a lot of biodiversity, that will suppress these pathogens. So that's very, very important. Also, we have the environment. And when we have poor soil health, we are also promoting an environment where some of these pathogens can thrive. For example, a very compacted soil can be poorly drained or have a lot of standing water, which creates a lot of problems with certain soil-borne pathogens that that can then wipe out a crop like Pythium or something like that, or Fusarium. And so the soil health comes in both in terms of the environment that is impacted by it, say the water conditions in the soil, as well as how dominant the pathogen is. So that brings us to the work that we've done at Cornell in terms of developing a framework for assessment and management of soil health, which we call the Comprehensive Assessment of Soil Health Framework, or CASH. And so we've established a laboratory that does soil health analyses and interprets the numbers and then provides advice. And it's based on 4 physical indicators, 4 biological indicators, and 7 chemical indicators, including 4 minor elements. And then we measure these indicators and we interpret the numbers on a scale from 0 to 100. And then actually we use some color coding to indicate where things are. Now, this is an interesting report because it shows that the chemical indicators are all scoring very high at 100 and are green. And that's because the typical farmer, certainly in the developed world, does a very good job of managing their pH and their nutrients. But you can see that the biological and physical indicators often are much more problematic. They're often red, which means a very low score. And that means that the soil is not biologically or physically healthy, even though it may be chemically healthy. We also provide an overall score in that respect. So we selected these indicators based on their relevance to important soil processes. So each of these represents at least 1 or 2 or 3 important processes like aeration or infiltration or organic matter decomposition, etc. We selected them to be consistent and reproducible. That's really important for an indicator. They can be sampled easily and analyzed easily at low cost. So this is the basic framework, and I'll show you a reference to that in my last slide. So how do we really sort of approach this? How do we measure soil health? And there's sort of a hierarchy of aspects related to that. So at the top level, we're concerned about soil services or ecosystem services. For example, food production, water quality protection. So this is at the highest level why soils are important as a resource. These services are in turn supported by soil functions like growing plants or supporting habitat in the soil. Then functions are supported by processes like organic matter decomposition or water infiltration. And processes can be measured through properties, right? So a process happens over time, and a property or an indicator is basically an estimate of that process by measuring it at a given time. So that's really where this soil health test comes in. So we measure these biological, chemical, and physical properties. And by doing that, then we can say something about the indicators, the processes, the functions, and the services. Okay, so that's philosophically and conceptually how we approach soil health management. So like I said, each of these indicators relates to a particular process, and they reflect an important part of the functioning of the soil. So I won't go into detail because a lot of these indicators are kind of well known in soil science. It's interesting with the biological indicators because they're relatively new. These are the ones, these 4 are sort of the probably the best indicators to measure for a routine assessment. So I just want to show you a little bit of data going back to the concept of how carbon and nutrients are being cycled. So we analyzed an extensive data set from our laboratory for the Northeastern United States, and we made a comparison between different cropping systems. So we have annual grain production which is what I mentioned earlier, where most of the carbon and nutrients are being harvested as the grain and then being sold off the farm. And similar for what we call processed vegetables. These are more industrial style vegetable production, often for canning or something like that. Then we have mixed vegetables, which is mostly organically grown vegetables. These tend to be smaller farms that use good organic practices. And then we have soil that's associated with a dairy farm, so there's cycling of carbon and nutrients through manure. And then we have pastures. So what you see in terms of the organic matter, that the systems where most of the carbon and nutrients are being sold off the farm as crops with little cycling, they show the lowest organic matter level. The more organic system with mixed vegetables have much higher organic matter level, especially the biologically active organic matter. And so does pastures, and so do the dairy crops. So we see that cropping system and the cycling of carbon and nutrients is really important. When we look at aggregate stability, we see the same pattern where the cases where there's more cycling of carbon and nutrients, we see much better aggregate stability than the ones where we remove most of the carbon. But the pasture system, which both has the cycling of carbon and nutrients, but also a lack of tillage because it's a much more stable system, that's where we see by far the best stability of aggregates. So in general, when we look at these different indicators of soil health, organic matter, active carbon, which is the biologically active component of organic matter, the proteins in the soil, respiration or the biological activity in the soil, available water capacity, so physical indicator, and aggregate stability, also physical, we see again the same pattern for all of these indicators where the intensive crop production, processed vegetables and grain crops, where most of the carbon and nutrients is being removed and sold off the farm, they have the lowest values for these indicators, while the dairy crop and the more organic systems have much better values, but the pastures have the best because this is the closest to really a natural system and there's no disturbance and there's no tillage happening. So we're learning a lot about how cropping systems themselves impact soil health. So the way we can look at that in terms of carbon and nutrient storage is that we may have very severely degraded soil where most of the carbon and nutrients that can potentially be stored in the soil, which is represented by the glass, there's only a little bit of that in that soil. When we have maybe a conventional crop farm, say rice production or maize or soybean, then we're maybe somewhere in the middle. But a livestock or organic farm, the glass is mostly full. That is, the capacity of the soil to retain carbon and nutrients and water is more optimum. And that's, of course, what we need to strive for. It also indicates that if we want to keep applying carbon, that the benefits would probably be the greatest in the more severely degraded soils because they are starving of carbon and nutrients. So that brings us to the final part, and that's basically how do we do regenerative soil management. And so an organic farm basically inherently needs to thrive for that regenerative soil management. First of all, I think we need to understand the current predicament that we're in terms of the type of agricultural systems that we have, and then identify opportunities for more efficiently and sustainably manage these nutrients and carbon and water in the soil. So that includes better practices, reducing tillage, better rotations, heavy use of cover crops, and especially recycling of organics. Sometimes that may mean reallocation of organic material, making it a priority to recycle organic material back to the soil. A lot of organic material is not efficiently reallocated. And then also the concept of priming. That is that when the soil becomes degraded and it's low in organic matter and nutrients. Adding some organic matter, like adding a certain amount of compost, really stimulates the biological activity in the soil, and this in turn stimulates better crop growth, more biomass production, and thereby more recycling of biomass. So sometimes we need to give that soil a little bit of a head start by priming the biological functions. So we need to be better at identifying suitable sources of organic carbon and nutrients. So better recycling of these materials. And we need to be aware that that carbon and nutrients are limited reserves and that we need to use them more efficiently. So here on the right here, just a little bit about composting. And of course, cover crops, a lot of attention on cover crops and finding ways to incorporate them into current cropping systems because they have so many benefits that you see here, depending on the type of cover crop that you select, whether it's a legume or a grass. They each have their benefits. Some may have more aggressive rooting systems, some add carbon and nitrogen. Rotations, of course, bringing legumes into the rotations with grasses and grains is also really important. So, and this is my last slide. It's, as I mentioned earlier, maybe some reading material that you might be interested in that you can access at the website that you see below, or if you just Google Cornell Soil Health, you'll get there. So the book Building Soils for Better Crops is a book that I co-authored with Fred Magdoff from the University of Vermont, and I think for many it's been a book of interest, and it's very practically written, not as much as a scientific or academic textbook, but more towards the practitioner. And we're going to be coming out with the 4th edition in a couple of months. So we've been publishing this book about every 10 years. And then on the left, you see the training manual for the comprehensive assessment of soil health framework that you can also download for free. And with that, this is my last slide. So I'm going to open it up for questions. Nitin, maybe would you like to, let's see, I don't have access to the chat box right now. Let me see what
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Harold, sir, for doing such a nice lecture on this topic. Now this topic is open for discussion, and if somebody would like to ask questions, please be free to ask questions.
Sir, actually 2-3 people have raised their hands, and thereafter we'll just move to chat box. So I will request first K. Ramesh from IOR Hyderabad. K. Ramesh, please. Yeah, Ramesh. Okay, I think he is not connected. Then Dr. Parameshwar, please. Dr. Parameshwar. Okay, anyway, we'll just, yeah, Dr. Zadav is there, Dr. Sham Zadav.
Zadav sir.
Yeah, Dr. Zadav, please.
काय होतं त्यांचं अनम्यूट नाही झालं अनम्यूटच नाही झालं अनम्यूट
So maybe I'm looking at the chat box here. And,
Dr. Herald.
Yeah. Yeah, please.
Go ahead.
Dr. Herald,
Yes.
Please.
in one of your slide, you have shown that protein content. So, does it mean that is total nitrogen content of soil?
And no,
That
I
is
mean,
considered as soil quality indicators. So, soil quality indicators are those which are sensitive to management practices. So, does it mean that total nitrogen or protein content?
so we are really actually measuring the protein content. So it's mostly the organic nitrogen that's in the soil, and we use a citrate extraction procedure that's explained in the manual. It's very interesting you're asking the question, because we have found in a number of research efforts that these indicators like protein and active carbon, which is a permanganate oxidation procedure, are the most sensitive indicators, both in terms of measuring the effects of different management practices, but are also mostly correlated to yield. So we know that the total organic matter or organic carbon has a relationship to yield, but it's these forms of labile carbon and nitrogen, so active carbon and protein, that show a much stronger relationship to yield. So it appears that having these labile forms of carbon and nitrogen in the soil is really very important.
Mr. Irshad Hassan, are you listening to me, Irshad?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please carry on. Yeah, Mr. Irshad, please.
Ramesh बना रहे हैं.
Okay, no issue. Ramesh, can I listen you?
Yeah, Ramesh.
Ramesh. Okay, Dr. Sandeep Menon. I think.
Am I audible?
Yeah, please, sir.
Hello.
Please. Yeah, please.
Sir, lecture was excellent. I have two queries. This biological health of the soil is a dynamic parameter, but still we are having a lot of emphasis on biological health. This is my first question. And one more question. Over the years, we are using a lot of chemicals in the soil. By the time, this beneficial microbe might have a new strain, and the long-term experiments conducted in India have indicated that even under chemical fertilizer feeds, the SMBC content is equal to that of organic.
Ramesh, sorry to disturb you, but
Yes.
We are not getting your clear voice. So I think Harold sir must have some problem just to listen. So kindly just come out where the connectivity is well, and then you can just ask your question, please.
Now it's clear.
Yeah, please.
I have two questions. In India, based on long-term experiments, the soil microbial biomass carbon content of chemically fertilized soil and organically fertilized soil is almost equal. Maybe the proportion of bacteria to fungus is varying. This is one point. What I feel, by the time over the years, even chemically soils, beneficial microbes might develop into in the soil.
Okay. Thank you.
Chat box में गए.
Yeah, sir.
Yeah,
Please.
I think I didn't like most of you. I don't think I quite completely could hear, but just maybe a comment. So the microbial biomass carbon and nitrogen is something that's also being measured to characterize the sort of the biological part of the soil. In our test and many others, the active carbon and protein sort of are ways to get at the same properties, but in a way that allows us to do it more rapidly as part of routine soil testing. So the indicators that I showed you are the ones that are very good if you want to do routine soil health measurements. There are many other indicators that we can use, like biological, microbial biomass, carbon, nitrogen. There's some fatty acid tests like PLFA that give you an indication of the community structure and for example, fungal bacterial ratios. EL-FAME is another example. Some people look at soil enzymes. And so those are all good measurements, but the ones that we use in our test are a little bit more broad spectrum, and they are also low cost, so that they can be used as part of routine soil assessment.
Thank you, sir. Now I move to Dr. Rajiv Kumar first. Dr. Rajiv Kumar, can you hear me? Okay. Then next, Dr. Sandeep Menon, are you there? Okay. Meantime, sir, we'll have question from chat box. So we'll move to first question of chat box, please.
Okay, Dr. Hal, sir, we have selected few questions from chat box. So please try to answer those questions. First question is from Dr. Basavaraj. He is asking how many years will require for converting living organic matter into dead and very dead organic matter. This is his question.
Okay, that's a good question. So the dead organic matter is any organic matter that's no longer alive. So if it's a plant that dies or becomes dormant, then that organic matter dies, and that's immediately available for decomposition by organisms. And of course, a lot of organisms turn over in the soil very actively. You know, bacteria, they regenerate themselves and they die very quickly. What we call the very dead organic matter is mostly what's has gone already through a decomposition process, and that's a simplification. I must say there's a lot of work being done nowadays, but it may take a certain amount of time. Now that varies based on the type of material. So if it's a fresh organic matter, like you may think of a green grass cuttings or something like that, that's very low in carbon to nitrogen ratio, so it has a lot of nitrogen and proteins in it. They get decomposed very quickly. It could be in a matter of days. But if it's more lignified organic matter, like say wheat straw, that may take a little bit longer, and that may take maybe in our area that may sometimes take 2 to 3 years before it really gets decomposed. But in a tropical environment, the turnover is going to be bigger. So it's very much a function of the type of organic matter, how quickly it gets decomposed. And the more lignified it is, and the higher the carbon to nitrogen ratio, the longer it takes for it to get decomposed. And in a way, you want a little bit of diversity of organic matter. You want some of it that is decomposed very quickly. It's kind of like sugar. When you eat sugar, you get a quick boost in your system. And some of it is maybe more like fibrous food, where it takes longer for your system to digest it. And so you need to have a combination of both.
We have another question from Mr. Mudassar. He is asking, can organic farming enough to build soil health?
Yes, I mean, so that's an interesting question. So, the good thing about organic farming, in my view, for soil health, is that it forces the farmer into good practices that promote soil health. So because of the limitations on, let's talk about fertility and nutrients first. So an organic farmer cannot use synthetic fertilizers, and there's nothing wrong necessarily about inherently with synthetic fertilizer. But like I said, it only feeds the nutrients and not the carbon, and so it doesn't stimulate the biological system. So an organic farmer is in a way forced to use organic sources of nutrients, whether they are applied as compost or manure, or whether they grow the nutrients as, say, a legume cover crop or a legume rotation. So an organic farmer naturally uses practices that are good for the soil. Okay. And then of course, to turn it around, a healthy soil is very beneficial to an organic farmer because it reduces the need for nutrients to be applied and also for pest control, chemical pest control, because the soil system is more suppressive. It controls the pathogens because you have a much more biologically diverse soil ecosystem, right? So the in a way, we've always thought of organic practices as just a set of practices that were believed to be good practices in and by themselves. Now we say, well, it also is really beneficial to the soil. And of course, many people who have promoted organic agriculture have known that. And I think there's been somewhat of a misunderstanding around fertilizers. So people sometimes say fertilizers are not good for the soil. In general, that's not the case. They're not bad for the soil. It's just that fertilizers are not, that they're not sufficient. You also need organic nutrients, okay? And so sometimes I'm a little concerned that people simplify this and say fertilizers are all bad. We need fertilizers to feed the global population, but organic practices are much more beneficial. So we need to use the organic sources of nutrients to maintain the soil health. And I think in a lot of cases, we've kind of forgotten why this is important to have these diversity of sources of nutrients and carbon into the soil system. Sorry for the long answer on that.
Thank you. Another question is from Dr. Bilal. He is asking, can we apply FYM or compost during the dormant period of plant growth, and how it will differ from applying during or just before the initiation of plant activity after dormant period is over?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the question. Is it in the chat box?
No, I'm just reading, sir. I'm just reading.
Okay.
Dr. Bilal is just asking, can we apply FYM or compost during the dormant period of plant growth, and how it will differ from applying during or just before the initiation of plant activity?
Oh, okay. Okay. Yes, it is. We have to be always a little bit careful about how we do these kind of things, especially when it comes to pathogens, because in general, we have the situation where we can suppress pathogens by, with compost and or good rotations, but we have to be a little careful. For example, certain cover crops can still be a host for a pathogen. So if you're growing different cash crops and you're growing cover crop in between, that is also a host for the pathogen. That's not necessarily good. Now, in terms of your question, it's generally better to apply organic matter somewhat before you start the growing season, and that's because there may be still some issues around pathogens. It also takes a little time for the nutrients to be released. So if you apply compost, because the nutrients are organic, it takes a little while for these organic nutrients to become available because they have to be decomposed. So I would say in general, I would apply compost or manure not right at the beginning of when you plant your crops, but do it a little bit beforehand so that the biological system can be primed.
Okay, thanks, Harold. I'm just trying to just move to Dr. Sandeep Menon. Is available. Dr. Sandeep? Oh, Dr. Wasim?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So, Dr. Harold, we are really thankful. It was a very, very nice presentation. You have just took the basic concepts. So my question is how the farmers, they can maintain the optimum C/N ratio under the organic system of cultivation, carbon nitrogen ratio, C/N ratio.
Yes, good question. So in general, in an organic system, of course, you need to have a release of that organic nitrogen. So the C to N ratio of stable organic matter is about 10 to 12. 10 carbon for every nitrogen. If you're in an organic system, of course, you want that number to be lower. So you want to have more organic nitrogen relative to carbon than 10 to 12. So you want to maybe be, 5 or 7 or 8, because that stimulates the biological activity to decompose the organic matter and to make it available as inorganic nitrogen after decomposition. So you definitely want it to be less than let's say 12, which is the sort of the stable form. So if you are applying a source of organic matter, like for example wheat straw or rice straw or corn stover, that will have a C to N ratio that's really quite high, that may be 50 or 70 or 80. And so it will not release any nitrogen for the crop. That's not a good source of organic matter to generate nitrogen for your crop. So you need to apply organic materials that have that have a much lower C to N ratio. For example, soybean residues are better, or any legume residue for that matter. Of course, compost will generally have much lower C to N ratio. Legume cover crops will have a very low C to N ratio. So those are very good sources of organic matter for organic production, because it will release the nitrogen that you would need if you are growing a crop that's not a legume. So if you're trying to grow an organic grain like organic rice or organic corn or organic wheat, you would need to have a source of organic matter with a low carbon to nitrogen ratio.
Yeah, sir. I think still many hands are there who have just raised their hand for question. But before actually moving to next one, I have a little query. Might be silly. I just want to know whether any direct relationship water and carbon, because in India most of the farmers are applying irrigation unscientifically. So is it any relationship with irrigation methodology or irrigation water and soil carbon itself?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, and by creating a healthy soil with a good amount of organic matter, you create a better sponge for water too. So the soil can retain more water, and if you have deeper roots, you can promote deeper roots. There's more water available. In some cases, the less irrigation water is needed because the soil can provide more of that water by acting as a better reservoir for water. Now, if you have a complete dry season where you don't have any precipitation, like you have in many parts of India during part of the year, I think the primary benefits that you'll see from better soil health is that irrigation water can be used more efficiently by the crop, and that the crop can use more of the residual water that some crops require. And I recall my visit to you in 2012, where we looked at a lot of the fields that grow crops on residual water in the black soils, and so having your soil will promote that.
Yeah, it was a saline tract where actually we visited it. The Kutasa and Ramagad village were there. and it's actually most degraded particular area in the vicinity of Akola, and which is actually having native salinity and most of the limitations for irrigations. So that's why it's a little very difficult actually for we people to manage the lands, and that's why the question was just asked to you, sir, regarding this water management.
Great. Great. Yeah, it will not, in general, having good organic matter cycling and all that will help reduce salinity problems, but it's maybe not the most direct way to address that. Salinity and sodicity are difficult problems, but it can by having better cycling of water through deeper roots and better water retention capacity, that will help to some extent.
Yeah, so we are fortunate that Dr. Vilas Kharche, who is Director of Research of this university, and he is in the group. So if he is available, I would like to request Dr. Kharche sir to just unmute himself and have an interface with Dr. Harold, please. Dr. Kharche sir, please. Can you hear me, sir? Dr. Kharche sir, please.
Yes.
Yeah, please.
Am I audible?
Yeah, sir, please.
So, this lecture by Dr. Harold was very informative, and I was listening to the interactions also. Good discussion was held, and this particular international training program is being organized by our university. So after a long gap, I heard Dr. Harold, and it was very nice to listen to you today evening. And of course, this particular lecture will be very much useful to the faculty and the participants. And once again, I thank you very much for your very valuable lecture here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And as far as my knowledge is concerned, he's traveling from Pune to Akola, and in travel he has made a conversation with you, particularly because he is basically soil scientist, and he is a director of research for this university. So we are at the end of this today's session. Now I'm just moving to Dr. Kulkarni for further proceedings and vote of thanks.
Before we end this lecture, sir, can I have one question I can ask? I have one question.
Go ahead, yes.
Okay. Now in India, particularly in Vidarbha, we have a very large area of soybean crop, and most of the farmers, they are using indiscriminately the weedicides or the herbicides. And I want to ask whether that herbicide use is affecting the soil health directly or indirectly. Is there any evidence of such an effect to your mind?
Yeah, this is I think a somewhat of an area of research and also somewhat controversial. There are people who have found that an herbicide like Roundup can have a negative effect on soil health. There's also arguments against that. Sometimes it also relates to whether the herbicide sort of allows for more sustainable practices. For example, glyphosate or Roundup can facilitate no tillage, and so it may have benefits that way. Indiscriminate use of herbicides is really not really recommended. You want it to be really based on the need. But herbicides, it's probably mostly the indirect effect that it might have, and how that fits into the overall cropping system. So it's not a situation where there's a clear this is good, this is not good type situation. It really is in the context of how the herbicide is used in a cropping system. And in some cases, it's being used to facilitate another practice that is very beneficial, like no tillage, and then the benefits outweigh the disadvantages in many cases. I think that some of the concerns around the use of herbicides like glyphosate have been that it sort of promotes a type of agriculture that's sort of focused on row crop production without having to be concerned about good rotations or other good management practices. And so it's a sort of an indirect effect that it might have. So that's a very complicated answer to a somewhat complicated question. I hope you are okay with that.
Okay, thank you. So,
Dr. Harold, again, we are fortunate that the post director of this particular training program and our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Dr. Bhale sir, he has also joined this particular session. So I request Dr. Bhale sir, please. Yeah, he has fortunately has joined because he has also. Yeah, Dr. Bhale sir, please.
Hello. Yes, hello. It's audible?
Yeah, sir.
Yes.
Dr. Kunde.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Dr. Harold has given very informative talk today, and which has the practical utility. I hope scientists and students definitely will be enriched with his knowledge. Dr. Haralji, thank you very much on the behalf of Vice Chancellor of the Dr. Panjabrao Krishi Vidyapit, Akola. I thank you to you for participation and giving a very informative lecture in this series of training on a field to fashion organic farming. And definitely this will be the first information, but we'll continue this relationship with your institution. And I thanks little bit. I later joined very late because I was in some other preoccupied program. So thank you very much for the organizing committee, Dr. Konde, Dr. Paslavar and his team. Very informative talk he has given, and let us keep in that the students, even those not attending today, it can be useful for the, you can relay this in some other occasions. So thank you very much and best luck.
Thank you very much, sir, for joining the session.
Thank you.
thank you, sir. So we are at the end of this training topic, and I request Dr. M.D. Giri sir to propose a vote of thanks.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, Dr. Harold sir, for taking us on a amazing tour of soils. And really, your lecture was very nice. And it has starting from importance of soil health to the disease cycle and its relation with soil health. And thank you very much for giving us this nice lecture. Then again, I am very much thankful to the entire core team for this making this platform. And I am also very much thankful to Honorable Vice Chancellor of this university for providing us this platform. I am thankful to all the participants. Thank you very much. Good night.
And Harold, again, I take this an opportunity and place my privilege and heartfelt thanks for joining this session and for sparing your very valuable time. And thanks for accepting our invitation, and definitely will be blessed with your knowledge and everything in future also. We'll definitely meet frequently just to enhance our and to strengthen our knowledge in respect of sustenance of soils, because the soil, unless and until soils are healthy, it is difficult to just go ahead. So thanks a lot again, and we'll see soon in another programs too. Thank you very much, sir.
You are very welcome.
Thank you. Good night.